Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome. We have a special presentation from one of our diamond partners, Vali Cyber. But before we get into that, the VMware User Group, or VMUG, is an independent, global, customer-led organization created to maximize members' use of VMware and partner solutions through knowledge, sharing, training, collaboration, and events. Get connected to a local VMUG community near you at myvmug.com. We have them all over the United States, all over the globe. So if you're looking for other VMware users near you, go to myvmug.com. During this webinar, please use the Q&A function for all of your questions. I know it's easy to use the chat, but the Q&A function allows us to track who asked what question, and if additional follow-up is needed, we'll be able to track your emails. So please use the Q&A function for all of your questions. And lastly, this session is being recorded. It will be distributed to all registrants after the webinar, and it will be posted onto our VMUG YouTube channel. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to Nathan from Vali Cyber.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tristan. Let me get my presentation shared out here really quick. Okay. All right. Thanks everybody for being here today. My name is Nathan Montier. I am a solutions engineer, also on the threat intelligence team here at Vali Cyber. And we have kind of an interesting presentation on the Anubis attack against Fairlife that happened just about a month ago, a little over a month ago, I believe, at this point. So I think you're going to get something good out of this. We're excited to talk about it and talk about the way that some of the things that we're working on over here at Valley help against this exact type of technique. So without too much further ado, I think I'll go ahead and jump into it and start sharing with you guys. So the attack that happened against the Fairlife subdivision of the Coca-Cola company, it was ultimately at the end of the day, this was a hypervisor attack. And that's really what this slide I want to drive at here at the very beginning is talking about why hypervisor security matters, and particularly for more regulated industries. There have been huge rises in the number of hypervisor attacks that have happened over the last few years. So you can see the number that we have on screen is a just over, I think, well, yeah, just right around 700% increase in hypervisors as targets as the end result of a cyber incident reported by organizations like Huntress. There's some other numbers that suggest slightly different figures, but it's always right around that mark for specifically for 2025. 2025 was a really big year for this, and it's something that we have continued to see even here in 2026, which is really what we're going to be driving at here today. Part of the reason that you see MITRE ATT&CK on the slide here as well is because it's something that's been recognized not only by organizations like Huntress and by us here at Valley, but also by organizations like MITRE, who've started to explicitly and specifically classify hypervisor attacks as their own kind of attack chains with their own specific techniques. If you've heard me give presentations on this before, you've probably heard me talk about that and about some of the changes that have been made to the attack framework around this. So the reason that I really bring this up here and now is because this applies to all hypervisors. Obviously, this is a VMUG event, so most folks that are in attendance are probably more interested in the ESX environment, right? The ESXi host being the hypervisor within VMware that most people are probably using in enterprise scenarios. But it really applies to everything. It applies to everything from, Citrix, Zen Server, Nutanix, any KVM-based hypervisors. All hypervisors are currently, I think, under attack. And we're gonna get more into that as we kind of move along here. But to get started with this particular one, let's talk a little bit about who Anubis is themselves. You may have heard of them before because although they are a young ransomware gang, they have been around now for just a little bit, and their tactics are going to be pretty similar to a lot of the other kind of like cutting edge, very modern ransomware gangs that exist here today. And there's a few things that really mark them and how they do business, some of the tactics that they use, some of the business strategies that they use to try and ultimately make money off of the ransomware attacks that they're perpetrating. So one of the big things is that they're affiliates. This is something that we've been joking about, I think, for the last couple of, well, I shouldn't even say joking. This is a pretty serious topic, but it is interesting to see, and I think it's a little bit funny to see that these ransomware gangs are following the model of other legitimate businesses in doing things like, for lack of a better term, things like affiliate marketing. Really, what this means is that Anubis will work with other affiliated groups that take other parts of the attack chain. So oftentimes for ransomware games, this can mean things like the initial access vector that they gain into an organization, or perhaps credential access, or even things like infrastructure hosting. These are all things that gangs like Anubis that have this affiliate model, they'll do profit sharing at the end of the day with these other organizations. So you can see that we have some figures on there, revenue splits from 50% to 80%, kind of being reflective of what we have seen Anubis do in the past. And this means that there's a way for everyone to make a little bit of money among all these criminals who are involved in some of these ransomware attacks, from those initial credential compromises all the way through until the ransomware is actually deployed. So we mentioned that they're a little bit of a younger group, and the struggle with ransomware gangs and with criminal organizations in the cyber sphere in general is that oftentimes there's a lot of overflow from one group to another. So you'll see some of the data that we have on here being that we've seen Anubis in some form or fashion since February 2025, but there's a really good chance that they were originally the Sphinx gang, and before that, probably some of the members who were involved in the operations that Anubis is doing were involved from other ransomware gangs in general, right? And it's a little bit speculative, but we know that it's something that happens with plenty of ransomware gangs, and we usually can get this either by observing the tactics that they use. So watching, oh, here's Sphinx, or here's WannaCry, or here's Anubis, or whoever, and they're using, XYZ tactic, and then we see that same tactic used, and it's very, very distinctive, a year later in another area. Sometimes it's them doing copycat attacks. Other times it's simply because the personnel who were involved in the first organization that maybe now no longer operates have moved over to a new organization, possibly with a couple of other, new people involved in their attack. So we know that they've been around since at least probably late 2024 as Sphinx, and then really with it being Anubis and kind of a rebrand in early 2025 is kind of what we know about Anubis currently. The last thing that we'll touch on here that makes them a little bit distinctive is the kind of the wiperware twist. So they do the standard double extortion thing, right? Where they both encrypt the data that they find on their targets' networks, but they also will threaten to expose that data and extort them if they don't pay sometimes the initial ransom or a second ransom. But another part of this is that the Anubis ransomware itself can actually overwrite the file context rather than encrypting them. So this really means that it's wiperware is kind of a secondary class of malware, really. Ransomware, the whole point is that the encryption makes it to where it makes sense to pay a ransom because the data can be recovered. The point of wiperware is really just to destroy the data. So it depends on exactly what the motives are, but this is an option that's open to Anubis. And it's not always something that we've seen with different ransomware actors. Wiperware is not unique, but it is perhaps a little bit unusual among some of the ransomware actors that are out there. So kind of some interesting information about them there. This is where we kind of get into this specific incident that we're talking about. So most of what we're talking about probably happened in early July. There may have been a kind of a longer loiter time, even stretching into May or June earlier this year. That is a little bit speculative. We don't know that for sure. But what we do know is that on July 16th, that was the initial disclosure where Coca-Cola let the world know that their Fairlife, subsidiary company had been hit with a ransomware attack, and that it had forced them to halt some of the production across some of those dairies that Fairlife manages. So I believe that Anubis themselves, they actually said it earlier, and this is pretty typical. This is something that we see with most ransomware gangs, is that there will be a public disclosure at some point, but usually the ransomware actors themselves are a little bit more excited to get this information out there, particularly if they're doing the double extortion technique, which we know Anubis is involved in, where they're going to threaten to release data, maybe trade secrets, proprietary information, that kind of stuff, if the victim doesn't pay the amount that they've set forward. So we see them do it about a week earlier, so earlier there in July, and then Coca-Cola comes out and discloses that, hey, yes, we did have a ransomware attack against Fairlife, and that was July 16th. So This is then where they get into threatening the data leak. And this happened a little bit later in July. So you can see the timestamp on one of the articles there being July 21st, where Anubis comes out and threatens to release the data. So this is where that extortion technique really starts to come into play. They claim that they'd stolen about 1 terabyte of data and that their Nutanix systems were fully encrypted. This is actually worth mentioning. So the specific hypervisor that we're talking about in this attack is actually Nutanix. It's Nutanix AHV, but this same Anubis group has attacked ESXi hosts, prevalently in the past. And part of the reason that we like to talk about this is because it is a broadening of their techniques. So if you've come to our presentations before, you've heard us talk about the MGM attacks. You've heard us talk about the attacks against MITRE. Some of the attacks that happened in 2025 against, large retail organizations or large other food distributors. Almost exclusively, these attacks up until this point have been against ESX systems. They've been against VMware products. Which is sad to see, but it makes sense because they make up so much of the market. This attack is interesting in part because it is something a little bit different than ESXi. Now, the principles are the same. And so from here on out, I'm not even going to talk about this so much because the techniques, the tactics that they use, they're using it on ESX, they're using it on Nutanix hosts. It gets used everywhere. So the last thing that I'll talk about here is just that wiper capability is it's a little bit novel for a ransomware gang, but it does mean that even paying the ransom is not necessarily a guaranteed way back. So every organization has to make decisions about what they do when an incident like this happens. But as in most of these cases, the recommendation is going to be to not pay the ransom. For a large number of reasons, and not being a small one among them is that it's really not even a guarantee that you will get your data back. We also note there at the bottom that, hey, preemptive hypervisor security controls are a really great way to avoid this problem entirely and to really help to buy down the risk of an attack like this happening. So we don't really know exactly what happened with this. Coca-Cola and the companies involved with incident response have not really disclosed exactly what happened, and that's pretty normal. We know that this is a sensitive topic, and also that kind of data can sometimes be used for harmful effects. So it makes sense that they haven't explicitly disclosed, but we have a pretty good idea based on the prior tactics of Anubis and other incidents that they've been involved in, as well as kind of recent events and what we've seen happen. One of the big ones is CVE 2025-5777. And this is a big CVE that focuses on Citrix bleed, or sorry, on Citrix VPN credentials, essentially. My apologies. I'm mixing two things. It focuses on Citrix, a vulnerability that exists in some of these Citrix devices that may be existing more at the perimeter and can give these attackers access into the environment. Alternatively, it could be VPN credentials. We have seen Anubis do that in the past as well, but very, very likely it's going to be one of those two things. This is, again, par for the course. Knowing what we know about Anubis, we know that they encrypt whatever they can get their hands on, essentially. And so once they gain that initial access, if they see a hypervisor like a Nutanix AHV or like an ESX system, there's a very, very good chance that what they're going to do is try to move laterally to get access to that hypervisor. If they can, they'll usually try and gain access to the admin panel. So if that's going to be maybe a vCenter server or something like that, so that they can get really, really fine-grained controls over the virtual machines first, and then also gaining access like maybe over SSH or RDP to one of those hosts as well. And then typically what they do is they encrypt the entire data store. And this is part of what makes hypervisor attacks so dangerous in the first place, is that you don't have to go virtual machine by virtual machine, right? You don't have to go through and, do crazy click operations through like a web UI or something like that. If you've got access to the underlying hypervisor, then you can just encrypt the entire data store really in one swoop. Which is really what we are seeing Anubis take advantage of a lot. The blast radius just becomes really, really large when you do something like that, enough to where it shuts down a company like Fairlife from being able to even continue operations for at least a period of time until they can restore access to those systems. So, yeah, one part of the technique that I didn't mention is also the extraction when they exfiltrate that data. Usually what they'll end up doing is they'll gain initial access, they'll get their hands on whatever they can get them on, they'll extract the data. Typically they'll archive it up, so they'll zip up, large directories or something like that, and then extract those archives. And then from there they'll actually launch the actual ransomware attack or wiperware attack, whatever the case may be, and whatever their tactic is for the organization that they're in. So I kind of already broke some of this down, but let's talk a little bit about the Anubis attack chain. And I will mention that there's a little bit of speculation here, but not a lot because we have seen what they've done in the past. So this is, sorry, excuse me. These tactics are going to be reflective of not only the details that we do know about the Coca-Cola Fairlife attack, but also the previous attacks that we've seen Anubis make against other organizations. So they typically gain initial access either via that Citrix CVE that we mentioned prior or stolen VPN credentials. And this is really where some of those affiliate groups come into play, particularly when we're talking about stolen credentials. Sometimes there's another cyber criminal gang who has done a phishing attack or has maybe done something even more sophisticated against individuals who exist in an organization to try and harvest passwords. After they do that, they may turn around and sell that to a group like Anubis for, an affiliate percentage of the overall attack, so that they can go and launch their ransomware because that's what Anubis has chosen to specialize in. So they gain that initial access. Once they do that, typically the next thing they're going to do is they're going to harvest credentials. So whatever level they have, they try and get into things like a domain controller, a vCenter server, other administrative panels, or like sometimes even cloud-based administration type stuff. And they try and harvest safe passwords from those environments. Or they'll grab password hashes and then bring them back into their infrastructure and then do cracking operations to try and crack those password hashes. After they do that, typically the next move is persistence. Anubis does focus a little bit more on persistence than other ransomware gangs that we've seen. However, for some ransomware gangs, this step will get skipped where they just want to produce effects as fast as they can. So this one's kind of hit or miss whether or not 100% there was a persistence mechanism that gets left behind and gets used long term. We do see that happen a ton with nation state threat actors. So if someone is more interested in, say, intelligence gathering or long-term espionage, those persistence mechanisms are going to be there. Think things like Brickstorm. That's a really good, or any of the Typhoon operations, or like Volt Typhoon and the associated campaigns. Any of those, you're going to see a lot of persistence mechanisms. Anubis does occasionally do this as well, and it's typically via well-known industry remote access tools, sometimes via kind of sneakier backdoors, but particularly on hypervisors, you don't really have to be that sneaky because most folks are not really monitoring very well. Around the hypervisor, sometimes there's good monitoring solutions, good defensive solutions, but typically within the hypervisor itself, you can kind of be a little bit noisy. So just kind of an interesting tidbit there. From there, it's really lateral movement. So you've gained credentials, you maybe have persistence if you're planning on staying long-term in this environment. Then they start to move around the environment. And this gets lumped in with defense evasion. You can kind of talk about these two at the same time because defense evasion is really part of how they do their lateral movement. So they'll move between different hosts, install more persistence as needed, and also pay attention to what defenses exist there, including things like backups, maybe packet inspection type network defensive measures. Those are the kinds of things they look for at this stage, and just ensure that they're doing everything they can to kind of skirt around them and or get access to the things that they need. Then comes the exfiltration step. In this particular case, we know that there was about a terabyte of data that was stolen by Anubis from the Fairlife servers. This is great for that double extortion technique. And then the last thing is really just that final impact of the attack, which is the encryption of the hypervisors. At the end of the day, this is what's probably going to cost them the most money over there at Fairlife. And it's the thing that is going to stop their operations, right? It's the thing that's going to put them in the headlines and make this a huge incident, more than it would have been under other conditions, right? So that's kind of a breakdown of the Anubis attack chain based on the things that we've seen them do in the past, the details that we do know about the Fairlife attack as well. So let's talk a little bit about why. I've already mentioned this a bit, but why the hypervisor was the target and why this has become such a trend. The most prevalent hypervisor in enterprise environments is VMware ESXi. Right there, nipping at its heels at a much lower percentage. But one of the next big players is going to be Nutanix, and then you're going to see things like Proxmox and Citrix kind of coming in there as well. All of them are very, very juicy targets. And the reason is because of some of the things that you see here, right? Hyper-converged infrastructure, consolidating everything into smaller physical footprints that still has that management plane of being a hypervisor, having the ESXi operating system or the AHV operating system. That administration layer then is broad enough to reach all of that virtualized infrastructure. So the exact thing that makes virtualization a benefit to most organizations is what makes it a really, really good target for attackers. It's the reason why they're so interested in it. So you can read some of the data that we have on here, things like backup images being stored in that same infrastructure. That's something that gets hit in the event of a hypervisor attack, assuming that they are stored in that virtualized infrastructure. Guest level EDR can only do so much. Oftentimes, something happening at the hypervisor layer is completely invisible to them. So a lot of folks that I've talked to in the past tell me these great stories about all of the host protection that they have on their virtualized endpoints. But the problem is, and the thing that you kind of come back to that with in many instances, is if you're thinking about where the holes in security still exist, it's underneath those. You can have the best, host-based guest VM security tool in the world running on one of those guest virtual machines. But if the attack comes from the hypervisor, that security tool is not going to be able to see anything or do anything because it exists in a sandbox away from where the attack is actually happening. Unfortunately, it will be affected by it though. So it's going to be a bad day still for those affected guest operating systems. And then yeah, it's easier because it's just one host, right? We talk about the stolen credentials, and that's true. But it's the fact that it's one, you only have to gain access to one host to affect all of the guest virtual machines that are running on top of it. So it doesn't matter which one it is. This is a specific class of incident and exposure and risk that exists in many organizations that are running their own hypervisors. And attackers are really starting to take notice, and they're starting to really see the value. Again, those increases that we saw in 2025 are a direct result of this. Some of these threat actors are seeing big payments that are coming out of gaining this level of access. So hypervisors are increasingly targets, and there's something that we have to take a little bit more seriously than we have up to this point. Which brings me to zero lock and why zero lock is so important. So if you've heard us talk before, you've heard about zero lock, and you've probably seen some of the things that I'm going to be talking about here. Zero lock is the first of its kind. It is a preemptive security tool that exists for hypervisors. We could talk about this another time. We also exist on Linux servers, but the hypervisor aspect is really what we're seeing a lot of people find value out of. And this is because the exact things that we're seeing attackers take notice of hypervisors for, that's the reason why zero lock exists in these environments. And it's the reason why we do things like command line utility multi-factor authentication, right? So you look at our CLI MFA, that is a capability that prevents attackers from using the types of tools that we might see administrators use, and it helps to preempt their attacks. It helps to cut them off before they're even able to gain access and to do the things they want to do. Things like modifying firewall rules, changing acceptance levels, those sorts of things are wonderful things that we can put behind command line multi-level or multi-factor authentication. One layer down from that, we have application allow listing, which just prevents folks from running unapproved applications on the host. One layer down from that, we really get into lockdown rules, which is where we talk about some of putting constraints on the behavior at the hypervisor layer. So think about things like, hey, here's a utility that we know that we have to have on our hypervisor, but we don't want to allow it to do everything, right? We don't, and if there's a vulnerability in it, we don't necessarily want that vulnerability to actually be exploitable. That's where lockdown rules kind of come into the picture there. And then our last layer is AI detection. And this is really for those unknown unknowns. At the end of the day, we know what ransomware looks like. We know what crypto mining looks like. We know what a lot of these kind of classes of threat look like. And we use AI detection to identify those even without a known signature, completely agnostic of what the binary looks like. Zero Luck just looks at behavior and uses a very, very small machine learning model to correlate that behavior with those malicious activities like ransomware. Something that we're really proud of, and it's kind of the last data point on this slide in particular, is that we do mitigate 100% of the MITRE ATT&CK ESXi TTPs when we're configured correctly, right? When you enable all of our protections, we are able to mitigate 100% of those tactics that MITRE has identified as being the tactics that are utilized against ESXi hosts. So something that I'll call out. This is a place that we focus. Something that makes us a little bit different than other security companies. Many security companies are coming from a perspective of either network or maybe Windows machines, and that's kind of their first mentality is to protect those hosts, and then perhaps they do things like maybe address Linux servers or something like that. We really began in this space. We began in environments like ESXi, and this is what we specialize in. This is what we pay all of our attention to, and it's the reason why we try and give presentations like this to educate people who maybe are paying less attention to hypervisor security in particular. With this crowd, hopefully I'm preaching to the choir, and hypervisor security is something that everyone in attendance here is already taking very, very seriously. And if that is the case, I hope that you'll share the information. This is a really easy format to be able to share out with other folks. So please do, and please help us get the word out about how big of a problem this is, how much money companies are having to pay for this, and really what can be done about it. So now that I've kind of talked through what ZeroLock does, I want to give some quick demonstrations. I've got a couple of demos we're going to get into here in just a moment, where I'll be able to show each one of those features that we saw in that kind of onion looking slide before. Something though that I didn't talk about yet is that we are actually approved by Broadcom. So the agent itself, our ZeroLock agent that we deploy to ESX servers, it does have a signed VIB. So it has a signed vSphere installation bundle, which means you don't have to lower acceptance levels. It means that it plays nicely with vCenter and with the rest of the VMware ecosystem. And we are a VMware Technology Alliance partner. And one of the things that we talk about with Broadcom, VMware, and VCF and the security tools they have out there is that we're really better together, right? So this is I think a message that we've been trying to share with people who are concerned about incompatibility, particularly in the VMware ecosystem. This is a place that we've spent a lot of time trying to work well with them and becoming friendly with Broadcom in significant ways that help us to have a good relationship with them, and ensures that ZeroLock works really well with all of their existing processes. One other thing I'll kind of talk about before jumping into the demo here too is how we deploy and what overhead looks like. I know that that's oftentimes one of the first questions we get from folks when we talk about this is, okay, but how much is this going to impact my compute, my resources? Am I going to see, service degradation from this? And I think that overall the short answer is no. We keep ZeroLock very, very small in performance. So you can see there on the screen, we say that the overhead in terms of memory consumption is about 50 megs of RAM. In terms of compute, in most environments, about 5% of one CPU core on an ESX host is typically how much the agent is taking. So really not a lot of compute. We have some secret sauce and proprietary stuff that we do under the hood to make sure that it stays very, very low overhead while still providing a lot of flexibility and observability into ESXi. We do have our own web-based console, but you can also take our data and you can forward it. You could see that on screen. There's mentioned with the API first framework, where you can take our data and you can export it into whatever your favorite SIM or store is that you're already using internally for monitoring on other systems. We can have ZeroLock integrate with that. It really is a very, very portable solution that can move to the environment where you need it, protecting your hosts very, very quickly. One other thing that actually isn't on here that I will also talk about, though, is that we can run this completely air gapped, and it has no dependency on outbound network connection. This is not a cloud dependent solution. This can all run on-prem in your environment without any outbound network connections. You can run it in an entirely air-gapped environment as well, which I think is worth talking about and bringing up. It is a question that we sometimes get. So now, without further ado, I will get into some of the fun stuff, which is the actual demonstrations of some of the capabilities that we see here with ZeroLock. The first one is that CLI MFA capability. Now, as I start this one, I'm gonna make sure the video, okay, there we go. The video did actually start. I'm gonna first give you a quick tour of the environment. That was the dashboard you're looking at. This is our list of protected endpoints. So you can see we have a few here. We got a couple ESX9, a couple ESX8 hosts. And on one of them, we've got these three virtual machines, Gandalf, Frodo, and Gimli. We're going to come back to those later, so I like to call them out up front. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show off some of that SSH CLI MFA capability. So I attempt to SSH in, I have a legitimate credential, I log in with it, and then ZeroLock prompts me to provide multi-factor authentication. So I give it the super user account at valicyber.com, and I give it my time-based token, and that's the only point at which I'm actually given access. And you can see I was eventually given access to this host. In the event of an attacker trying to gain access, and maybe they stole credentials or they bought them from one of these affiliate ransomware gangs or something like that, this is an area where ZeroLock already provides value by being able to block some of that, even when someone has those authentic credentials. If they didn't also steal the time-based token generator or the MFA capability of one of the administrators, then they're going to be locked out of this host regardless, even though they have the root password for SSHing in. The next level down is that application allow listing. Now, this one's going to move pretty quick, so I'm going to talk a little bit about it before I start the video. This one, really what we're doing is ZeroLock maintains an approved list of software that can run on the host that it's protecting. And if it sees something that comes in that's not that, then it implicitly denies it. So in the case of this particular demo, we've got the agent running and we have, a malicious actor who has SSH access and it's me. And I'm going to attempt to I'm going to attempt to download using wget the Brickstorm malware. This actually is the real Brickstorm malware sample. I'm going to attempt to download it and then I'm going to run it through chmod plus X, which is going to make it executable. And then the last bit is I'm going to actually attempt to execute it. So I'm going to go ahead and start the video so we can watch what happens as we go through this exercise. So we'll go ahead and run that command. We see that it looks like the download worked, the wget went through, but my connection did get closed. So this is kind of a bad day for me as an attacker. And there is an alert. It's flagged as suspicious executable. It's a hash alert. Coming in here, we see some of the data that's associated with this Brickstorm alert. We saw that there was all the files that got affected. And then here we can also see all of the processes that were involved in this attack, including the final call to try to execute the Brickstorm binary, right? So this is a lot of really, really good data that ZeroLock provides every time it sees something that it needs to alert on or take action against. In this case as well, ZeroLock was able to take action against this and prevent it from executing in the first place. In other scenarios, we could actually also configure ZeroLock to block the wget so no one would ever even be able to download anything. I allow the wget in this instance just so that we can fully demonstrate this capability and show you what happens if someone somehow does manage to get a binary that shouldn't be there onto a hypervisor. ZeroLock can just implicitly deny that. This is really useful for things like malware, where someone does have a new file they're trying to bring in. So that's really the reason that this one exists. Okay, now we're going to get into lockdown rules. And this is where things do get a little bit complicated. And I apologize, we'll be moving pretty quick. I'm happy to take questions about this later, though, too. Lockdown rules, as I mentioned earlier, really where we get into behavioral constraints. In the example that I'm about to show you, I'm going to go ahead and start the video so you can see this happen. In the example I'm about to show you, I am going to be using I believe this is going to be a Power CLI script. Yep. And it's going to be triggering that lockdown rule that you see there. It's called ZeroLock service manipulation through host D. You can see that it's monitoring host D. And without breaking down that full command, essentially what it's looking for is any calls to remove ZeroLock using a command line utility. There's the script itself. You can see it's a legitimate Power CLI script that we're going to run against this ESXi host. But it looks like the command that we attempted to run actually failed. So let's look at the alert that's associated with it. Because it was killed, and yes, it has the same name as that lockdown rule, ZeroLock service manipulation through host D. No files were affected. This was a fileless attack. We are only using the API. We can see that the attack came through host D, and then it went down and it spawned a shell where it attempted to run an ESXi command to remove ZeroLock. But ZeroLock was able to notice that because it had a lockdown rule that defined that specific behavior, and it was able to also take action against it. Specifically in this instance, you can see there in the top left-hand corner of the screen that ZeroLock killed this process. That was the expected response, since that was what we told ZeroLock. If it observed this behavior, we want it to kill that process so that it prevents any kind of follow-on activity. Now, I know that's a lot. That's why I'm going to give one more example of how these lockdown rules can work. One of the things that we talk about with these is exploit prevention and virtual patching. The reason we call this a virtual patch is because we're not Broadcom, we're not VMware. We can't actually patch their software, but unfortunately, software vulnerabilities do exist. Now, I'm actually going to pause this here for just a minute because this part is important. Now, this lockdown rule, it's program execution rule, is looking for VMX. VMX is one of the processes that's involved in virtualization on ESXi. So it's one of the processes that handles the guest operating systems. VMX it's going to be looking for it to spawn a target process, so a child process that matches something like this. Now, for those of you who are familiar with what VMX is supposed to be doing, you know that VMX is not supposed to be doing that. VMX should really not be spawning any of those things. For the most part, it should just be sitting doing the work of virtualization. So for it to be doing anything like this, that would be anomalous. Unfortunately, there have been several new critical vulnerabilities that have been disclosed around ESXi that deal with virtual machine escapes. If you've been following the news around this kind of stuff, you saw some a couple months ago coming out of the Pwn to Own competition. Last year's Pwn to Own competition also had some vulnerabilities disclosed of the same type, all of them dealing with virtual machine escape. And ultimately, at the end of the day, those escapes coming through the VMX process. So you can see that's the reason why we have this lockdown rule in the first place. It's to address vulnerabilities that exist against VMX. Under normal operating conditions, this is not something that will happen, but it will happen if someone attempts to execute one of those vulnerabilities. And to demonstrate that, I'm gonna get back into the video. We're going to get back to the spot that we were at. And there we go. To demonstrate that, I'm actually going to exploit one of these vulnerabilities. So we have an in-house proof of concept that we whipped up around one of these vulnerabilities. Now, what you're looking at is a target virtual machine. It's just an Ubuntu guest operating system. And we've got the vulnerability loaded on, or the exploit loaded on here. And it says that it was able to successfully escape the VMX process and escape to host. But it looked like we might have had a little bit of a problem. And if you look here, within our alerts page, we actually do see there's an ESX or a VMX alert that popped up. Again, no files created. But over here, we can see that something's coming through init, through the VMX process, and then trying to spawn an outbound netcat connection. So very, very likely that's malicious behavior trying to reach out of the network to an attacker's machine and give them shell access to the underlying hypervisor. But ZeroLock was able to detect it because it could look at all the processes on the host. It saw VMX doing its thing, and that's great. VMX should be there and it should be doing its thing. But we know that there are vulnerabilities against it. And so ZeroLock is able to monitor VMX and ensure that it doesn't do anything that it really shouldn't be doing. At the end of the day, that's why we call this a virtual patch. You should still apply the real patch as it becomes available and as you have resources to do it. But in the meantime, ZeroLock lockdown rules can be applied as kind of a virtual patch, and they can be done live too without requiring any kind of remediation or reboot or anything like that. We can apply a lockdown rule in real time so that we have mitigation and we buy down the risk of that vulnerability being exploited because ZeroLock prevents it from being effectively exploited. Okay, as one of the last things here, this one is really, really fun. This is going to be our kind of AI detection and remediation capability. Now, I'm going to break down the commands you see on screen here because it's a little bit complicated. This is essentially a one-line script that's targeting the Gandalf virtual machine, as you can see right here. It's targeting the Gandalf virtual machine that I showed you earlier. And this is a living off the land ransomware attack. So if you're unfamiliar with living off the land attacks, essentially what this means is we're not going to bring in new binaries. We're not going to download Brickstore. We're not going to do anything like that. We're only going to use utilities that already exist on this host. So we're going to use things like grep, xargs, OpenSSL, RM, things like that. Typical shell operations on this ESX host that we don't have to download to do a ransomware attack. And we can do this because utilities like OpenSSL, they're very, very important. And they exist on all ESX hosts because they're important for encryption. They're important for modern security. But unfortunately, if an attacker gains access, they can also be used to encrypt files on that host. So you can see we're also using this kind of silly, bad ransomware password there. In a real attack, obviously, that would be more secure, but it's just a one-for-one switch. So let's kind of see what happens as we go through this one. This is a really interesting attack, and it's something that ZeroLock can do that's pretty neat. So we went ahead and reran that, and we saw that our connection got closed. So that's a bad day for us as the ransomware actor. And it does look like we got a ransomware alert. A couple files were affected. So down there, we can see the Gandalf VMDK file, so one of the virtual disk files. It looks like it got modified and then a new one got created with that kind of spooky file extension with the nuclear radiation. We can see all of the processes they got run, and it does look like the Gandalf VMDK did in fact get targeted. So if I come over here to that Gandalf virtual machine and I try and power it on, unfortunately, it can't find the original VMDK, and so we're kind of toast, right? This is a bad day for us as the administrators of the system. But what I'm doing now is I'm remediating the attack. So what that means is ZeroLock is going to go back, it's going to look at all the file system changes, and it's going to revert those files back to the state they were in before the attack happened. And after I did that, and I come back over and I try and boot into Gandalf again, this time it works. And that's because ZeroLock was able to restore the files. Now, I want to be clear about what this means. ZeroLock is not a backup solution and it's not taking snapshots. It's not doing anything like that. All it's doing is as it runs on this ESXi hypervisor, it's monitoring all of these processes. And when those processes make file modifications, ZeroLock keeps track of what those modifications are. Then, if it's determined that, hey, something malicious happened, it can look back at what those processes did and it can revert all of those changes. So it can essentially just undo the changes it keeps those changes saved in a directory that only ZeroLock has access to, a little cache that ZeroLock protects itself. It keeps those changes there, and then as needed, it can revert those files back to the state they were in before the detection. So it's a really, really powerful capability. And we do that because this is a behavioral solution, meaning we have to observe ransomware to know that it's ransomware because we're not looking for signatures in this case, right? We're saying, hey, we want to just look and see what behavior it takes. If it does what ransomware does, then it's ransomware. And when we do see that, then we can revert those files. It's a really, really powerful capability. It's kind of one of those last lines of defense. Now, this last little part that I want to show you actually here is a kind of a bonus one, which is a specific lockdown rule that we have for blocking rogue virtual machines. So this is another technique that gets used specifically on hypervisors where virtual machines get spawned from the command line and they're not registered in vCenter. And I just showed you one of the commands that gets used to do that. And what we can see here is within ZeroLock, we've configured it to where it can detect against this. So we can observe, hey, someone is trying to start a virtual machine, create a virtual machine rather, from the command line, which is not the way that we would expect that most people should be doing that. And so ZeroLock is able to alert on that and then also prevent it from taking place, which is what we see here. Okay, so I know this has been a lot of information. I really appreciate you guys sticking with me. This is an important topic. In the moment that we are in cybersecurity, hypervisors are more under threat than they ever have been before. I think we can say that without reservation, is that this is one of the toughest times out there for in terms of security, at least, and in terms of targeting for hypervisor administrators. If you are interested, a couple of these QR codes will lead you to different things. So we have a one sheet that talks about Fairlife in particular and how we would prevent that kind of attack from taking place if ZeroLock had been in place. There's some resources there for investigating free licenses for ZeroLock if you want kind of a test license. And then over on the far right, we also have an assessment, so you can get a pretty decent understanding of what level of risk you currently have against in your ESX environment, so in your hypervisor environment. I really recommend all of these resources. Please, take a picture, grab a scan of any of those QR codes, and share them with anyone else who didn't have a chance to make it here today as well. I'll move back to that page here in just a second, but I really appreciate you guys sticking with me. I hope you guys see the importance of this, and now I'm happy to take any questions. So thank you guys again.
Nathan, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. Hi, everybody. I'm Megan Howard. I'm the VP of Marketing with Vali Cyber, and we're here to answer your questions. Just feel free to throw them in the chat window and we can get right to them. While we're waiting for folks to write up their questions, Nathan, a couple of things. So
Sure.
I'm actually going to take us off of Fairlife. I definitely have some questions about that, but
Yeah.
this is new. You probably haven't seen this yet because you have been talking the entire time. This literally
Uh-oh.
just dropped.
Oh no.
So we just got an alert around Aurora ransomware targeting ESXi, and using SpaceX's Cursor AI agent to
Oh.
do some attacks. Yeah. So, initial reactions. I know you haven't had a time to look at this, but um, are you not surprised? Are you surprised? What are your initial reactions here?
Yeah, no, not at all surprised. I'm sad to say you really hate to hear about things like this, but and if I'm understanding you correctly, again, I haven't read any of this, but
Yeah,
there was SpaceX's one of their AI models was involved in Aurora targeting ESX hosts for ransomware deployment. Is that more or less correct? Is that essentially what's going on?
that's what it looks like. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this would be the first time that I've heard of an AI enabled attack targeting ESXi specifically, but I definitely think that it makes sense. Anyone who's been following any news in cybersecurity recently has seen a lot of the chatter around AI model enabled cyber attacks, and it's definitely a real thing, right? This is probably something that's going to increase the rate of cyber incidents. Will be AI model involvement in attacks and their operation and everything. So no, it's not overly surprising me. It is sad to see, and it is interesting because this is again the first time that I think I've heard of that specifically targeting ESXi. It's very validating to hear and to be talking about, hey, this is a big problem. This is something you need to be paying attention to, and then to actively have news drop that this is something that attackers are doing. But I feel bad for the teams who have to address it because I know it's going to be a really really nasty issue. Um,
100%.
yeah, I think those are my probably my initial reactions to that.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna do a deeper dive into this, everybody who's joined us today, and I'm sure you'll see a webinar where we can show you more about what we've uncovered.
Yeah.
around this in the near future. So stay tuned for that. We do have a question that just came in, Nathan, which is
Sure.
how Zero Lock is differentiated from Trend Micro's deep security that includes virtual patching as well as ransomware protection. And I think
Yeah, it's a good question.
environment is the key point here. So I'll let
Yep.
you take that.
Yeah, I believe so. I believe environment is going to be the kicker here. So I'll be honest that I'm a little bit less familiar with the exact product that Trend Micro is putting out right now and what their compatibility levels are. It is not my understanding that is approved for, nor is it deployable to hypervisors, or at least certainly not to ESXi to my understanding. I'd be curious about any data that shows that it is, right? Or if people have done experimentation about it, I would love to hear about that. But the biggest differentiator between us, what you're seeing with Zero Lock and with Trend Micro and their products, because they've done good work in a lot of areas, is compatibility with the host that and the special targeting and threat intelligence that we've done into ESX hosts specifically and into hypervisor specifically. I'd say that's probably the biggest distinction is really just platform, where they're targeting versus where we're targeting.
While we're waiting for folks to post any additional questions, going back to the Fairlife attack. Now, I've got kind of some bigger questions that popped into my mind as you were going through things, Nathan. And I was curious. We have Fairlife, which is a subsidiary of Coca-Cola, right? So you have this Coca-Cola parent, and we may not know the answer to this, but I'm curious when you've got these huge corporations and then these subsidiaries within them, from an IT perspective, what would you say, what would you think is kind of best practice? Are we fully segmenting out all of those subsidiaries? Does there need to be points of interaction in between, but does that also introduce weakness into your IT structure? What would your thoughts on that be?
Big question there, Megan. This, I think it's a really good question when we see things like the structure of a lot of like modern day corporations where there's, one kind of parent organization and then the ones that underlie them. This is really probably going to be different on an organization by organization basis. So I think it's fairly apparent that with Coca-Cola and Fairlife, there's enough segmentation that this did not bleed over into, the Coca-Cola company at large, stopping their production and getting into their hypervisors and everything. I would suspect, based on my understanding of industry and how most organizations are doing their thing, that's probably going to be pretty par for the course. Probably most of these subsidiaries are maintaining their own infrastructure. They have their own branding, they have their own operations and kind of supply chain pipelines. So for the most part, I would suspect there is segmentation. Now, to the second part of your question, though, which is kind of, a little more what qualitative, is that a good thing? Should we see more of that? Is that kind of the direction we want things to go? I think yes. I think as much as possible, microsegmentation is a good idea, or segmentation in general. I shouldn't say we talk about microsegmentation with VCF and VMware environments, but segmentation in general is good because it reduces overall attack surface for different organizations, right? If you've got this organization over here and this organization over here, and there is a connection between them, but we've segmented off their networks, then there's a good chance that we can contain things. So it's good, right? It's definitely good. I think that segmentation overall, because it reduces attack surface, it also reduces the risk that there's going to be something that breaks containment and is able to make it from one organization to the other. That being said, it's also less efficient. So that's really what I think a lot, and that's why I say it's really on an organization by organization basis. Folks are going to have to make decisions um, about how much segmentation they can handle based on how much administrative overhead or annoyance or inconvenience that is going to cause in actual operations. It's the same story that we see with microsegmentation. It's the same story we see with any kind of putting a barrier between two parts of a given system, is that there's going to be some inefficiency that's introduced by that. In some instances, it's fine because they don't need to share that much information. And that's why I suspect in the instance of Coca-Cola, Fairlife, and other large parent-child organizations, probably segmentation is the way to go, and it's going to be fine because they don't need to share that level of data between each other. Definitely a good practice overall. Would recommend it as much as possible. Things should be segmented or micro-segmented. It's just a healthy recognition that it's not always possible to do that to the nth degree, I think is crucial.
Yeah, very fair. We do have a few more questions for folks, so let me dive into those. So one
Sure.
is how zero lock licensing works. Is it per
Yep.
host or
Yeah.
a rev
Good
level or
question.
VM count?
Let me jump right into that one. So yeah, it is by core on ESX host. So in hypervisors, we do it by core. We know that most folks are used to licensing things for those environments by core, which is why we kind of have followed suit with that. So we do price things by your core count in the environment where it will be deployed for ESX hosts. As a caveat, if you are interested in other than hypervisor protection, so specifically Linux protection or something like that, then we actually do switch to a by host model at that point. And I would love to point you towards our sales team who can give you all of the accurate numbers on exactly what those would be, what costs would be, that kind of thing. But in a basic sense, it is per core annual typically is what we've seen with most folks that we work with.
Yeah. Let's see, another question. So if an attacker has already obtained root level privileges on the hypervisor, what
Yep.
are the actual limits of zero lock's protection? Are there any scenarios where a threat actor could disable, remove, or bypass zero lock before it has a chance to detect and respond? I love
Not
this
really.
question because anti-tampering, baby, here we go.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a really good question. And it's a very valid question because that is typically a huge limitation when it comes to security tooling and having like administrative access. This is something that from day one, Zero Lock was built to prevent. So you'll notice something interesting about ESX hosts in general that again, this count you probably already know this, but the root the root account, the administrator account at ESX is what most folks are using when they are doing administrative tasks on their ESXi host. The reason I talk about this is segmentation, kind of leading back to the previous thing that we talked about, right? Like role-based access controls, trying to separate things. ESXi hosts already, just by default, by the way that they're architected, don't do a great job of this. So most administrators are already logging in as root. So if someone does have credentials at all for ESXi, there is a very, very good chance, and I mean a threat actor, right? If they've somehow gotten credentials for ESXi via whatever other stuff they've been doing before getting on the hypervisor, there's a very good chance the credentials they have are the administrator credentials. They are the root credentials. So from the get-go, ZeroLock was developed to address that exact scenario. You probably saw in all of the attacks that I ran today in those demos, I was logging in as root. So to answer your question, what can we do? How much can we prevent? Everything you saw today applies to root credentials. We do ZeroLock does not privilege root the same way that the operating system does, I think is what I would say in short. So ZeroLock is 100% able to address someone who has root credentials. They will have a very hard time deactivating ZeroLock. That is something that I personally have actually done a lot of testing on, doing some of the threat intelligence and kind of red teaming of the agent and everything, trying to shut down ZeroLock as an administrator account on ESX. It is something we paid specific attention to and put up a lot of safeguards to prevent that happening. So everything that I showed you and everything that we talked about today is privilege level agnostic when it comes to the user credentials that they have. All of that should apply to someone who has an administrator account on ESX.
Awesome. We have just a few more minutes left before we sign off. So if there are any remaining questions, please don't hesitate. Um, I've got kind of just one last one as we're kind of thinking about this. I do feel, Nathan, that we've been seeing an unfortunate increase on threat actors focusing on beverage and manufacturing organizations. And I'm
Yeah.
curious to get your opinion on this. Is it because there's, this perceived urgency to restore production, so quickly that,
Yeah.
maybe victims might be more willing to pay? Do we think that this is a trend that's going to continue? What do you think? Not holding your
Yeah.
feet to the fire, but just what are you?
No, yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that it's speculative, right? This is
Yeah,
all very speculative. What I would say probably, because you're right, that has definitely been a trend. We've seen a lot of big, I think like food, yeah, food and beverage, right? Like basically like food supply chain stuff. I think one is what you said, it's like the urgency to restore it because the supply chains, I think, have a small disruption causes a pretty big impact in a food supply chain because I think things move so quickly. Like that's not a product that sits for forever before moving on to the next stage in the supply chain. So I think from a business perspective, it's competitive for a ransomware actor to target someone who's in that space. If I had to speculate, though, I would also guess that there's probably less of a focus on security for companies like that. And I don't have a lot of experience with this, and I wouldn't want to point fingers at anyone for this either. But I would just guess that overall organizations like that are busy, they're moving fast, they have a lot of moving parts. And again, I think the supply chain focus is huge. And I think that when you have segmentation is probably a little bit hard in that supply chain, right? Just to kind of draw back to that. Like when you have so many moving parts and things have to move so fast and you're a company who's profitable, who's doing well in that space, you're just not focused on security probably quite as much as you could be. That's not necessarily the case in verticals like financials or healthcare, which are also big targets for ransomware, but they're ones that are inherently a little more focused on security, right? Just by the nature of their business, they kind of have to be, usually because of regulatory compliance and that kind of thing. And I just think that kind of these food and beverage companies, it's probably been less of an expectation for them for a long time, which means, just on average, I would suspect they're more vulnerable than some of the other large organizations. So big impact and a little bit less preparation for organizations. Again, all speculation. I don't know that for sure, but that's what I would guess.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you, VMUG, for hosting us. Thank you, Nathan, for a fantastic presentation. Before we do sign off, guys, it is Thursday, August 27th. What are you doing next week? You're going to be at VMware Explore, right? We're going to be there. In fact, Nathan is going to be there. So if you want to continue this conversation about hypervisor security, hit him up. He'd love to buy you a drink and talk about it more.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for having us again, VMUG, and we will hand things back over to you, Tristan.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, Megan. Thank you, Nathan. Always a pleasure with you too. And as they mentioned, there's no better place to be next week other than Las Vegas at the Venetian. So we will see you all there. As well as Explore. Coming up in a few months, we have VMUG Connect Orlando, which Vali Cyber, as one of our diamond partners, will be exhibiting at. So we hope to see you all there as well for that event. If you'd like to learn more, feel free to scan this QR code. Here's just another announcement for Explore. We'll see you all there next week. And just to close out, this session was recorded. It will be distributed to all who registered via email and posted onto the YouTube channel. Once I close out the webinar, you all will be prompted to fill out a survey. Please fill this out. It only takes a few minutes, and it helps us provide you fresh and relevant content for all future webinars. Speaking of that, Vali Cyber will actually be giving another webinar on the 24th, and we're hoping for registration to on the 24th of September, excuse me, and we're hoping for registration for that to go live either today or tomorrow. So look out for that, and we'll see you all on the 24th of September for their webinar. And lastly, use code COMMUNITY for 10% off a 1-year VMUG Advantage membership. Thank you all for joining. We'll see you in Vegas next week and have a great rest of your day. Take care.